If you have ever imagined that the glittering halls of Europe's palaces were places of peace, refinement, and honor, allow me to take you behind the curtains, for in those velvet shadows, far from the gaze of commoners, whispered secrets decided the fate of kings, queens, and nations. Blood was spilled not only on battlefields, but in silken chambers lit by candlelight, where betrayal was served with wine, and affection was often a mask for murder. Welcome, dear listener, to History 1. Subscribe now, so you will not miss the hidden stories yet to come, the tales they never wanted you to hear. And now, let us begin our journey into the secret world of velvet shadows, the lavish life and dark plots of the European aristocracy. The story begins. The chandeliers of Versailles glittered like stars, but the corridors smelled faintly of fear. It was said that in the Gilded Age of Louis XIV, nothing happened without someone watching, whispering, or plotting. Ladies in gowns stitched with gold thread drifted through the salons like painted dolls, smiling sweetly, while their eyes measured enemies and allies alike. Behind those smiles, poisons were mixed in perfumes, letters were forged, and fortunes ruined in a single careless phrase. The nobility lived under an invisible blade. Wealth was abundant, yet security was fragile. The king demanded loyalty, but he also delighted in watching courtiers tear each other apart. The court was a theater of velvet and venom, where the wrong word could mean exile, and a false smile might mean survival. One such secret began with a young duchess, born into privilege, but ensnared in a game she never chose. She had been brought to Versailles as a bride of alliance, married to a duke twice her age. To the public, she was the image of grace. In private, her nights were filled with letters written in trembling hands, letters that carried the weight of treason. For hidden beneath the powdered wigs and lace collars was a world of clandestine societies. Some whispered of secret orders among the nobility, bound by oaths of blood. Others spoke of shadow networks that stretched from Paris to Vienna, where princes and dukes plotted not only against their monarchs, but against each other. It was in these societies that rumors of poisons first spread, the infamous affair of the poisons, which would stain Versailles with scandal. Noble ladies, desperate for love, wealth, or revenge, sought the services of fortune-tellers and alchemists. In perfumed rooms, thick with incense, powders, and potions were exchanged, some for passion, others for death. One night, deep within the palace, a servant carrying a tray of wine overheard something that would never leave his mind. Behind a half-closed door, two voices whispered urgently. The words were sharp, deliberate. The king's heart must fail, and it must appear as God's will. The servant froze. His tray trembled in his hands. To speak of what he had heard would mean death, but to remain silent could mean damnation. He left the wine outside the door and fled into the labyrinth of corridors, his mind heavy with the knowledge that the Sun King himself was marked. And yet, the story of the Velvet Shadows did not end there. It only deepened. For what truly bound the aristocracy was not loyalty, but fear. Fear of losing power, fear of losing favor, and above all, fear of being forgotten. And so, beneath the glitter of chandeliers, Europe's nobility continued their dangerous dance, where every bow concealed a dagger, and every embrace could end in betrayal. The intrigue spread like smoke through the salons of Versailles, curling into every ear but never revealing its true source. The servant who had overheard the whisper of regicide told no one, yet he was not alone in his suspicion. In the hush of late-night gatherings, nobles leaned closer to one another, speaking as though shadows themselves might carry their words to the king. The Duchess, young and restless, found herself drawn deeper into these whispers. She had never imagined her marriage would lead her into such peril. Her husband, the Duke, was a man whose laughter hid secrets, whose friends arrived unannounced, cloaked in midnight. She often pretended to sleep while he received visitors, but one night she could no longer bear her ignorance. Rising silently from her bed, she followed him through the winding halls to a chamber used rarely except for secret councils. There, through a crack in the heavy oak door, she saw them. 5 men of noble rank, each wearing masks embroidered with golden thread. They spoke not as courtiers, but as conspirators, debating how the throne might be turned to their advantage. Their words were sharp as steel. The Duchess caught fragments. Austria must not rise. The king is but a man. Destiny favors the bold. She realized with a chill that stiffened her spine that their schemes reached beyond France. This was no mere courtly quarrel. This was Europe itself trembling on their tongues. Her heart thundered as she hurried back to her chamber, where she collapsed upon her bed. She understood in that moment the truth of her life. She was not a bride, nor a duchess, nor even a woman in her own right. She was a pawn, and pawns, she knew, were often sacrificed first. Days later, the Duchess received an invitation, ornate parchment sealed with crimson wax, summoning her to the salon of Madame de Clermont. This lady was known not only for her beauty, but for her dangerous gift of listening. In her presence, words slipped easily from the tongue, often never to be forgotten. The Duchess hesitated, yet to refuse would draw attention. The salon that night was filled with laughter and music, but beneath it all lay tension as sharp as a blade's edge. Madame de Clermont welcomed her warmly, offering wine sweetened with honey. But the Duchess noticed how every word spoken in that salon seemed to circle around her, as though she were being tested. Gentle questions about her husband, casual remarks about his friends, a jest about loyalty to the crown. It dawned on her then they suspected her. Whether of knowledge or of treachery, she did not yet know. The Duchess returned home, her mind racing. She wrote letters she dared not send, confessing her fears to a cousin in Vienna. She burned them one by one, watching the ink curl into smoke, afraid that even her words might betray her. Yet she could not escape the feeling that eyes followed her wherever she went. Servants paused too long in their bows. Courtiers smiled too widely, and every shadow in the palace seemed to breathe with secrets. Meanwhile, the masked men moved closer to their goal. They whispered of poisons, not the crude vials sold by street alchemists, but delicate powders that vanished into wine without a trace. They sought out a woman known as La Voisin, a figure half feared and half revered, whose potions had already claimed the lives of lovers and rivals alike. The affair of the poisons was not yet public, but its roots were spreading through the nobility like ivy through stone. And so, Versailles glittered on the surface, dazzling in gold, while beneath its velvet shadows, death itself was being prepared. The Duchess began to notice subtle changes in her husband. The Duke, once careful and composed, grew restless. His hands trembled when he signed papers. His eyes darted toward the door, as though he feared someone listening. At night, he woke drenched in sweat, muttering names she did not recognize. She dared not ask too many questions. Questions were dangerous currency at court. But his decline confirmed what her instincts had already told her. He was entangled in something vast, something that gnawed at his very soul. One evening, as the court prepared for a masquerade ball, the Duchess discovered a scrap of parchment tucked within her husband's desk. Its edges were singed, as though meant to be destroyed in haste. The writing was brief but chilling. The powder will arrive from Florence. Use sparingly and with patience. The king will falter. The throne will open. Her breath caught. Florence. Italy was famed for its apothecaries, masters of subtle toxins masked by perfume and sweetness. She knew then that the whispers were no longer mere threats. A plan was in motion. Her husband's hand, whether willing or coerced, was upon it. The masquerade unfolded in a blaze of light. Masked faces laughed beneath glittering chandeliers. Music echoed through the halls, and the scent of roses and wine clung to the air. Yet behind the silken laughter, tension coiled. Courtiers watched each other as hawks circling prey. The Duchess moved through the crowd with a fixed smile, though her heart hammered against her ribs. It was then she noticed Madame de Clermont speaking with her husband in a secluded alcove. Their masks concealed their expressions, but their postures betrayed urgency. The Duchess drew closer, pretending to admire a tapestry. She heard only fragments. "Tonight, test of loyalty. The wine must..." Her blood ran cold. She realized that the ball itself might be the stage for their plot. The king, radiant in his golden mask, drank deeply from goblets brought by loyal servants. Or were they loyal? The Duchess's eyes scanned the hall, desperate to spot a sign, a gesture, anything to reveal the truth. Every cup of wine seemed suspect, every toast a possible death knell. The night stretched on, a blur of music and unease. At last, the king retired unharmed, still laughing at some jest as though the world itself adored him. The Duchess felt a surge of relief, yet she knew danger still lingered. If the powder had not been used tonight, then another night awaited. Days later, whispers began to swell again. Servants muttered about sudden deaths, minor nobles collapsing after dinners, physicians baffled by invisible causes. The king's own food taster fell ill, though he survived, pale and shaken. The rumors spread like wildfire, poison. Versailles buzzed with fear, yet no one dared speak openly. The Duchess's nights grew sleepless. She wondered whether to confront her husband, to beg him to abandon the scheme, or to remain silent and hope to survive whatever storm approached. Her silence, however, carried its own peril. For at court, those who knew but did not act were often punished as harshly as the guilty. Her decision was forced upon her one evening when a sealed letter arrived, delivered discreetly by a gloved hand. The wax bore no crest, only a plain seal. Inside, in a hand she did not recognize, were words that froze her heart. "You are seen. Speak not of what you know, or you shall share his fate. When the velvet falls, silence is survival." The Duchess dropped the letter as though it burned her fingers. Someone was watching. Someone knew her torment. And now, she was no longer merely a pawn in her husband's game. She had become a piece on the board herself, marked for either sacrifice or use. The velvet shadows thickened around her, and she realized there was no safe escape. Only choices, each more perilous than the last. The Duchess began to live as though she were walking on a tightrope strung over an abyss. Every smile, every glance, every word at court felt like part of a performance. She learned to steady her trembling hands, to keep her eyes calm even as her mind churned. Survival demanded masks finer than silk, and she wore hers as carefully as any jeweled headdress. Yet her husband was unraveling. The Duke's health worsened, his nights filled with violent coughing fits, his appetite fading. Some whispered that he himself had tasted too much of the powders, whether by accident or as punishment from those who supplied him. The Duchess watched him with a mixture of fear and pity. If he fell, would she be condemned alongside him? Her doubts deepened when she was summoned discreetly to a chapel at the edge of the palace grounds. The message came through a servant whose eyes never met hers, whose lips spoke only the words, "At midnight, the chapel." "Come alone." The Duchess obeyed. Cloaked in a heavy mantle, she slipped through the sleeping palace, her footsteps echoing faintly in the stone corridors. The chapel loomed in silence, its candles casting long shadows. Inside, waiting for her, was not a priest, but Madame de Clermont. The lady's beauty seemed sharper in the flickering light, her smile too knowing. "My dear," she said softly, "you have seen much, though you do not yet understand." The Duchess's voice wavered. "Why am I here?" "To protect yourself," Madame de Clermont replied, stepping closer. "You are cleverer than your husband. He stumbles through the game, blind and desperate. But you," her eyes gleamed, "you can survive it." The Duchess's heart pounded. "What game?" "Speak plainly," Madame de Clermont laughed, though without mirth. "Plain speech is not our way. But listen, the king has enemies, and not all of them wear masks at balls. Some sit at his own table. If he falls, others rise. Your husband chose his side poorly, but you may yet choose wisely." The Duchess felt the ground tilt beneath her. Was this an offer, a threat, or both? Before she could answer, Madame de Clermont pressed something into her hand, a small vial of crystal, sealed with wax. "Keep this safe. One day it may be the difference between your life and your death, or his." The Duchess stared at the vial, its contents shimmering faintly in the candlelight. Was it poison, an antidote, a test? She wanted to throw it away, yet her fingers clutched it tightly, as though it had already bound itself to her fate. Madame de Clermont leaned closer, whispering, "Remember, my dear, velvet hides much, but shadows reveal all." And with that, she was gone, leaving the Duchess alone in the silent chapel. From that night onward, the Duchess carried the vial hidden in her gown. It weighed upon her more heavily than any jewel, a secret talisman that tied her to the web of plots closing around her. Soon, whispers reached her ears of arrests in Paris. Fortune-tellers and alchemists dragged from their homes, accused of selling poisons to noble women. Torture chambers filled with screams as confessions poured out. Names of buyers, names of victims, names that echoed into Versailles like thunder. Fear spread through the court like a plague. One evening, the king himself summoned his courtiers to the Hall of Mirrors. His gaze swept over them, cold and unyielding. "I know," he said, his voice ringing through the chamber, "that among you are traitors who sought to strike not only at me, but at France itself. I will find you. And when I do, velvet will not shield you. Shadows will not hide you." The Duchess lowered her eyes, but her heart hammered with the fear that his words were meant for her. For she knew too much now, and knowledge at Versailles was the most dangerous poison of all. The arrests grew bolder. Nobles once untouchable were seized at dawn, dragged from their gilded apartments with only moments to gather their dignity. Whispers filled the corridors. A marquise had been accused of poisoning her rival's gloves. A countess confessed under torment that she purchased powders to inflame a lover's desire. Each story sent ripples of terror through Versailles, for every confession pointed to another name, and no one could be certain when their own would be spoken. The Duchess moved like a ghost through this storm. She attended salons, smiled politely at dinners, curtsied before the king, all while clutching her secret vial and the dread that her husband's name would soon appear on some parchment of accusations. Her worst fears took shape when word arrived that La Voisin herself had been captured. The notorious fortune-teller, who had sold charms and poisons to half the nobility, was in chains, and her tongue was said to be loose under fire. The Duke, pale and fevered, confined himself to his chambers. His strength waned, but his eyes burned with panic. One night, when the palace was quiet, he seized his wife's wrist with surprising force. "If they come for me," he rasped, "you must deny everything. Burn my letters, destroy my books. Promise me, you will not betray me." The Duchess looked into his sunken eyes and wondered, had he not already betrayed her by dragging her into this abyss? Yet she nodded, because to refuse was unthinkable. That night, while he slept fitfully, she crept to his desk. Letters, scraps of parchment, strange symbols drawn in haste. She fed them all to the fire, watching the flames lick away every trace of his treason. And yet the vial in her gown remained untouched. Days later, summons arrived. The Duchess's heart froze as she read the seal. She was to present herself before the Chambre Ardente, the special court established to try the poison cases. She dressed carefully, her gown immaculate, her hair adorned with pearls, armor of silk against the jaws of suspicion. The chamber was dark, oppressive. Judges in black robes peered down at her, their faces impassive. Questions came sharp and quick. Did your husband consort with La Voisin? Did you purchase powders or potions? Did you hear talk of plots against His Majesty? The Duchess answered with practiced calm. No, she had never met La Voisin. No, she had never touched such wicked things. Yes, she had heard whispers, but she dismissed them as gossip. Her voice wavered only once, when they asked if her husband had spoken against the king. She lowered her eyes, murmuring that he was a loyal servant, though her heart knew otherwise. At last, the judges dismissed her. She walked out trembling, but outwardly composed. For now, she was safe. But she understood what safety meant at Versailles. Not innocence, only invisibility. When she returned to her chambers, she found her husband gone. Taken, the servants whispered, by the king's guards. No trial was announced, no sentence proclaimed. He had simply vanished into the shadows of the Bastille, as so many others had. The Duchess stood alone in her chamber, staring at the empty bed where her husband once lay. The vial pressed against her skin, a silent reminder of the choice still before her. To keep it was to remain bound to the web of poison and power. To destroy it was to risk losing the only weapon she possessed in a world where trust meant death. She whispered into the silence, "Velvet hides much, but shadows reveal all." And as she spoke, she realized the truth. In Versailles, survival was not about loyalty, nor love, nor even honor. It was about learning to live within the velvet shadows, to wield them as shield and dagger both. The Duchess had not chosen this life, but now she would master it. The Duchess's world narrowed after her husband's disappearance. No official word ever reached her, but the silence was worse than any sentence. At Versailles, absence was itself a verdict. Some whispered he had died under questioning. Others claimed he lingered in a dungeon, neither alive nor dead, his fate a warning to others. The Duchess knew better than to ask. Questions could be as fatal as poison, and so she rebuilt herself. Widowhood, though never formally declared, granted her a strange kind of freedom. With her husband gone, she became both more vulnerable and more dangerous. Men who once ignored her now bowed deeper. Women whispered her name with a mixture of pity and suspicion. She walked carefully among them, masking her fear with elegance. It was during this uncertain time that she was summoned again. This time not to the court of judges, but to the private apartments of Madame de Maintenon, the king's secret consort. The summons alone was enough to make her blood run cold. To be noticed by Maintenon was to be measured, weighed, and perhaps used. The Duchess entered the room with trembling hands hidden in her gown. Madame de Maintenon, plain in appearance but sharp as a dagger, sat with her embroidery, eyes lifting only briefly. "Sit," she commanded softly. The Duchess obeyed. "You are spoken of," Maintenon said, her needle flashing in the candlelight. "Your husband's name was among the whispers, yet you remain." The Duchess inclined her head. "I serve His Majesty with loyalty." A faint smile curved Maintenon's lips. "Loyalty is a fragile word. Some serve better as watchers than as wives. Tell me, child, what do you see when you look at this court?" The Duchess hesitated. To speak too boldly was dangerous. To speak too meekly, useless. At last, she chose her words with care. "I see that shadows move faster than light, madame. And those who survive are those who learn to follow them." For the first time, Maintenon looked at her fully, her gaze unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Perhaps you are not as fragile as you appear. Stay silent. Stay observant. You may yet find safety." The Duchess bowed, her pulse racing. She had not been condemned, at least not yet. She left the chamber with a sense that her life was no longer entirely her own. That night, she retrieved the vial once more, holding it to the candlelight. It seemed almost alive, its liquid shimmering with a promise of power. She realized then why she had never destroyed it. In a world where trust was poison, true power lay not in loyalty, but in possession. To hold a weapon, even a secret one, was to hold the choice of life or death. As weeks turned into months, the poison affair consumed Versailles. Executions were held, nobles disgraced, whole families ruined. Yet, through it all, the Duchess endured. She mastered the art of listening without speaking, of watching without being watched. Whispers began to change. She was no longer merely the unfortunate wife of a fallen duke. She was a survivor, but survival at Versailles came at a cost. Each time she glanced into a mirror, she saw less of the young bride she had once been. Her eyes had grown sharper, her smile more controlled. She had become part of the very world she once feared, a woman woven into velvet shadows. And deep inside, she knew the story was far from over. The court's appetite for intrigue was endless. New enemies would rise, new plots would form, and one day the vial she carried might demand its use. For in Versailles, nothing glittered forever. Beneath the chandeliers and silken gowns, the darkness always waited, and the Duchess, no longer innocent, was ready to meet it. The seasons changed, yet Versailles remained a theater of glittering dread. Snow fell across the palace gardens, coating the fountains and statues in silence. But inside, the salons pulsed with rumor and suspicion. The affair of the poisons had scarred the nobility, leaving gaps at dinner tables and empty seats at the opera. Still, the hunger for power never faltered. Like ivy, it clung and crept, growing again where it had been cut away. The Duchess learned to wield her new reputation with care. Invitations arrived more often now. Salons where her presence was noted, hunts where her laughter was observed, dinners where men leaned closer to hear her guarded words. She revealed little, yet the less she spoke, the more others filled the silence with their secrets. she became a mirror in which they reflected themselves, and with each reflection, she gathered knowledge. One evening, at the salon of the Comtesse de Ségur, she overheard a conversation that froze her blood. Two noblemen, flushed with wine, whispered of a plan that reached beyond France. "The Austrians tighten their grip," one said. "If the king falters again, alliances may turn. There are those who would see a Habsburg bride on our throne." The Duchess knew enough of history to understand the peril. France and Austria had danced on the edge of enmity for generations, and such whispers hinted at treason deeper than poison. To replace France's bloodline with Austrian influence was not only politics, it was a reordering of Europe itself. That night, unable to sleep, she clutched the vial Madame de Clermont had given her. Was this the very storm it had been meant for? A weapon not against her husband, nor against a rival, but against something larger, an invisible war for crowns and empires? Her doubts sharpened days later when she was once again summoned, this time to a secluded garden pavilion. The messenger bore no crest, but the handwriting on the note was unmistakable. Madame de Clermont. The Duchess arrived at dusk. The pavilion was lit with only a single lantern, shadows pooling like ink. Madame de Clermont waited, wrapped in velvet, her face half hidden by a hood. "You have survived," she said, her voice low and measured. "I wondered if you would." The Duchess lifted her chin. "You placed me in danger." "I placed you in the game," Clermont corrected, "and you have played well. That is why I summon you now. France teeters, my dear. The king grows older, his strength fades, others circle, waiting for weakness. But those who act swiftly will shape what comes." The Duchess's heart pounded. "And you expect me to act?" Clermont's eyes gleamed. "Not yet, but soon. You carry the vial still, yes? Good. That vial is not only a poison, it is a choice. One day someone will place before you a cup, and you must decide whether to sweeten it with death, for the sake of France, or for your own survival." The Duchess stared at her, torn between dread and fascination. "And if I refuse?" Clermont smiled faintly. "Then you will be swept aside, like so many before you. This court has no place for innocence, only for shadows." The meeting ended with no further explanation. The Duchess returned to her chambers, the words echoing in her mind. She now knew with certainty that her life was bound to forces greater than herself. She was a widow, yes, but more than that, she had become a vessel of possibility, a keeper of a secret that could alter destinies. And as winter gave way to spring, and Versailles bloomed once more with music, gossip, and ambition, the Duchess carried her vial closer to her heart, for she sensed the truth. The next move in the game of velvet shadows would demand everything she had become. Spring at Versailles carried the perfume of blossoms and the stench of fear that never truly left its halls. Courtiers paraded through manicured gardens as though nothing had changed, yet their eyes betrayed them, sharp, darting, calculating. The affair of the poisons had burned many, but it had not cleansed the court. It had only taught the survivors to hide more carefully, to strike more subtly. The Duchess understood this now better than anyone. She had begun to sense the invisible lines that crisscrossed Versailles, binding some nobles in fragile loyalty, while setting others against each other like wolves. She saw alliances formed in a glance, betrayals in a smile. Knowledge had become her armor, and silence her sword. Yet the vial still haunted her. Each night she would retrieve it from its secret place, watching its strange shimmer in candlelight. Sometimes she imagined pouring it into a goblet, watching as the liquid vanished into wine. Whose lips would she guide it to? A rival's? A conspirator's? The king's? The thought both terrified and tempted her. Her temptation deepened when she received a new summons, not from Madame de Clermont this time, but from a man of power she had long feared, the Marquis de Louvois, the king's minister of war. His invitation was brief, bearing only the words, "Your presence is required." She entered his chamber with care. Louvois was a man of iron will, feared even among the highest nobles, his gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "Your husband," he began without preamble, "was a fool. He thought himself clever, but he served poorly and chose his allies worse. France has no use for such men." The Duchess kept her face serene, though her stomach twisted. "But you," Louvois continued, leaning forward, "have shown discretion. You survived when many did not. That interests me." She inclined her head, her voice steady. "I wish only to serve His Majesty." "Good," Louvois said. "Then you will serve as eyes and ears. You will attend salons, listen, watch, and bring me what you learn. There are whispers of foreign hands meddling in our court, Spain, Austria, even England. If you value your life, you will find out the truth." The Duchess felt the weight of his command like chains upon her shoulders. To refuse was impossible, to obey was perilous. Yet she understood at once. This was survival. She was no longer merely drifting in the shadows. She was being ordered to walk within them. That evening, she returned to her chambers shaken. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the casket where the vial lay hidden. She held it tightly, whispering to herself, "They think they command me. But in this, I still hold power." From then on, her role shifted. She became both participant and observer in the endless game of deceit. At salons, she listened more than she spoke, storing away every careless phrase, every hint of conspiracy. Sometimes, nobles leaned too close, testing her, offering veiled invitations to secret gatherings. She accepted only what she must, always cautious, always weighing whether each step forward was worth the risk of a blade at her back. And all the while, she sent carefully chosen words to Louvois, never too much, never too little, enough to satisfy him, but never enough to damn herself. Yet the deeper she stepped into this role, the more she realized she was no longer merely surviving Versailles. She was becoming part of its very engine, a silent player shaping its hidden currents. The Duchess had once been a frightened pawn. Now, she was learning the moves of a queen. Summer burned hot over Versailles, the fountains glinting like molten silver beneath the sun. Yet even in the brightness of day, the Duchess felt the chill of unseen eyes upon her. She had grown adept at her role, attending salons, lingering at card tables, strolling gardens where whispers bloomed as quickly as flowers. Courtiers mistook her silence for naivety, but in truth, she was weaving a net of knowledge. One evening, she sat at a salon hosted by the Duc de Saint-Simon, a man who loved nothing more than to dissect the lives of his peers. As he prattled on, she caught fragments from another corner, a Spanish envoy, laughing too loudly, hinting at debts owed and favors promised. Later, she watched as he slipped a sealed letter to a French noble whose hands shook as he tucked it away. The Duchess felt the weight of Louvois' command pressing upon her. She could report this. It would please him, perhaps strengthen her standing, but she hesitated. Every word she gave to Louvois bound her tighter to his leash, and in Versailles, a leash, no matter how gilded, was still a chain. That night, she unlocked her casket and held the vial again, She thought of Madame de Clermont's words. It is not only poison, it is a choice between obedience and independence, between being used and becoming the one who used. Her chance came sooner than expected. A banquet was held in honor of visiting envoys from Austria. The hall of mirrors glittered with candlelight, the tables groaning under silver platters. The Duchess, seated farther from the king, observed everything. The glances between nobles, the nervous smiles, the cups refilled a little too eagerly. She saw the Spanish envoy again, leaning close to whisper to the Austrian ambassador. Their alliance seemed too comfortable, too practiced. Then, a chill swept through her. A servant passed near, carrying a goblet meant for one of the envoys. She recognized him. Not a palace servant, but one of Madame de Clermont's men. His hand brushed his sleeve before offering the wine. The Duchess's pulse roared in her ears. The vial in her possession suddenly felt heavier, as though it had leapt across the room to haunt her. Was this the night? Was the choice no longer hers, but theirs? She forced herself to smile, to sip delicately from her own glass, though her throat was dry as dust. She watched the envoy lift the goblet, his lips nearly touching the rim, when suddenly a commotion erupted. Another servant stumbled, spilling wine across the floor. The moment broke, the goblet was set aside, and laughter replaced tension. But the Duchess knew what she had seen. Someone was moving pieces upon the board, just as she had been told, and she, with her vial untouched, remained both witness and participant. Later that night, she returned to her chambers shaking. She realized with dawning clarity, Louvois was not the only one using her. Madame de Clermont, the foreign envoys, even the king himself, all sought to bend her fate to their will. She was no longer caught in one plot, but in many, each twisting around the other like serpents. For the first time, she whispered to her reflection, "Perhaps the vial is not for them. Perhaps it is for me." The thought chilled her, yet also gave her strength. To wield it was to end her fear, either by claiming power or by ending the game altogether. In the velvet shadows of Versailles, she had discovered the most dangerous truth of all. Survival was not given. It was taken. Autumn descended on Versailles, gilding the gardens in red and gold. The crisp air carried the scent of smoke from countless hearths, but within the palace walls, the atmosphere was no less stifling than summer. The affair of the poisons was said to be ending. Trials concluded, sentences carried out, the guilty burned or imprisoned. But those who lived inside the velvet shadows knew better. Nothing ended at Versailles. It only changed its mask. The Duchess had learned to move like water through the labyrinth of intrigue. She gave Louvois scraps of information, just enough to keep suspicion from her, never enough to bind her too tightly to his will. She listened more than she spoke, storing away secrets as though they were jewels. Yet she remained haunted by the vial. Some nights, she dreamed it shattered in her hands, searing her skin. Other nights, she dreamed she tipped it into a goblet, only to drink from it herself. One evening, while walking the moonlit gardens, she encountered Madame de Clermont once more. The woman seemed to appear from nowhere, her cloak blending into the night. "You have not used it," Clermont said softly, her gaze fixed on the Duchess's face. The Duchess's voice was steady. "No, not yet." Clermont tilted her head. "Do you know why that vial was given to you?" The Duchess hesitated. "To test me, to bind me, perhaps to tempt me." A smile ghosted across Clermont's lips. "All true, but also to free you. In this court, power lies not in titles, not in riches, but in choices. The vial is not death. It is the power to decide when another life ends. That power places you above them all. The Duchess studied her in silence. She wanted to laugh at the cruelty of it, to be told that survival depended not on loyalty nor virtue, but on the willingness to kill. Yet deep inside, she could not deny the truth. Versailles was built upon blood hidden beneath velvet. As if reading her thoughts, Claremont whispered, "Soon you will be forced to choose. Be ready." And with that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving the Duchess trembling in the cool night air. The choice came weeks later. A private dinner, intimate and quiet, hosted in the apartments of a nobleman the Duchess scarcely trusted. She had been invited suddenly, and though she feigned indifference, her instincts screamed caution. The table was laden with delicacies, crystal glasses catching the flicker of candlelight. Yet as she lifted her goblet, she noticed the faintest shimmer along the rim, as though dust clung to the wine. Her heart seized. Someone had already played their hand. Across the table, her host raised his own glass, smiling too widely. "To the health of His Majesty," he declared. The Duchess's mind raced. If she drank, she risked death. If she refused, she revealed suspicion, and suspicion was its own death sentence. Slowly, with steady hands, she reached for her gown. Beneath the silk lay the vial. In a movement so subtle no one noticed, she tipped the faintest drop into her wine. The two poisons mingled, indistinguishable. Then she raised the glass to her lips, eyes never leaving her host. He drank first. She sipped after, barely wetting her mouth. Minutes passed, filled with hollow laughter and shallow conversation. Then, her host's smile faltered. His hand shook. A bead of sweat slid down his brow. The Duchess set her goblet down, untouched. Her pulse pounded, but her face remained serene. She watched as the man's voice broke, as his body stiffened, as servants rushed in too late. When it ended, all eyes turned to her. She feigned horror, pressing her hand to her lips. "God preserve us," she whispered, but inside, she knew the truth. For the first time, she had chosen. The velvet shadows had claimed her, not as a pawn, not as a victim, but as a player. The days following the dinner were drenched in whispers. The sudden death of her host was declared an unfortunate accident. A weak heart, perhaps too much wine. Physicians shook their heads gravely. Courtiers murmured condolences, and the matter seemed to dissolve into the endless river of Versailles gossip. But the Duchess knew better. She alone carried the truth, that a single drop from her vial had shifted the course of her fate. Far from condemning her, the incident elevated her. Nobles who once overlooked her now sought her company. Some believed her untouchable, protected by fortune or by the king's unseen favor. Others looked upon her with wariness, sensing something dangerous behind her composed smile. The Duchess wore both masks with ease, moving gracefully between admiration and fear. Louvois summoned her not long after. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, studied her as though weighing her soul. "Strange, is it not," he said, "how men fall dead at supper these days? Yet you always survive." The Duchess lowered her gaze. "Fortune spares me, my lord." Louvois' lips curved in a thin smile. "Fortune, yes, or perhaps skill. Either way, continue to survive. His Majesty has no patience for the weak." It was not a warning. It was acknowledgement. Louvois knew she was more than she appeared. He did not expose her. Instead, he seemed to accept her as part of the machinery of survival. The Duchess left his chamber shaken, but also emboldened. Her reputation grew. Invitations multiplied. not only from French nobles but from envoys of Spain, Austria, and England. Each sought her ear, her presence, her approval. Some offered gifts, rare jewels, silks from the East, promises of influence. She accepted with grace, giving little in return. Each offer was a thread, and she held them all, weaving a net so vast even she marveled at its reach. But every rise carried peril. In mirrors, she saw her eyes changing, sharper, colder, glittering like steel beneath velvet. She remembered the terrified girl who once burned letters by candlelight and wondered if she still existed at all. One evening, she received another summons, this time from Madame de Maintenon. The king's secret consort had grown ever more powerful, her influence shaping not only the king's heart, but the fate of France itself. The Duchess entered Maintenon's chamber, where the lady sat in quiet majesty, her embroidery set aside. "You have been noticed," Maintenon said softly. The Duchess inclined her head. "I seek only to serve His Majesty." "Do you?" Maintenon's gaze pierced her. "Or do you serve yourself?" The Duchess held her breath, a dangerous question with no safe answer. At last, she replied, "At Versailles, to serve oneself is to serve the crown. For what am I, if not a reflection of His Majesty's greatness?" For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then slowly, Maintenon smiled. "Clever, very clever. Be cautious, child. Shadows can protect, but they also consume." The Duchess left trembling, yet exhilarated. She had not only survived Maintenon's test, she had impressed her. That night, she sat alone in her chambers, the vial before her on the table. Its liquid shimmered in the candlelight, a reminder of choices made and choices yet to come. She realized that she no longer feared it. It had become part of her, as much as her jewels or her silks. And in that moment, she understood. She was no longer merely surviving Versailles. She was mastering it. The velvet shadows had not destroyed her. They had remade her. Winter returned to Versailles, blanketing the palace roofs in frost, muffling the gardens in silence. Yet inside, the air simmered with tension. The king, though still commanding, showed signs of age, his stride slower, his temper sharper. Whispers crept again through salons and corridors. Who would shape France's future when the Sun King's light began to dim? The Duchess had become a name both feared and admired. She walked the Hall of Mirrors like a figure from legend, her silence heavier than words, her glances capable of unraveling men. But such power was fragile, balanced upon perception. A single misstep, a single accusation, and she could vanish into the Bastille like her husband. She knew this, and so she sharpened her instincts, living each day as though it might be her last. One evening, at a supper hosted by the Marquise de Montespan, once the king's mistress, now fading yet still dangerous, the Duchess found herself seated near a foreign envoy. His accent betrayed Vienna, his manner a little too bold for French taste. Between courses, he leaned close, his voice a velvet whisper. "France bleeds itself dry in wars," he murmured. "Alliances shift. There are those in Austria who would reward a friend at court most generously." The Duchess smiled faintly, as though flattered by idle flirtation, though her pulse quickened. Here it was again, the hand of Europe reaching into Versailles, testing, tempting. She did not reply, only let the envoy see a spark of intrigue in her eyes before she turned the conversation to safer topics. But the seed had been planted. Later that night, she replayed his words in her mind. To some, such an approach would be treason. To her, it was opportunity. For every secret offered, every temptation dangled, became another thread she could weave into her net. yet danger tightened as swiftly as opportunity. Louvois summoned her once more, his tone more pointed than before. "I hear," he said, "that Austria's envoys take an interest in you. Interest can be dangerous, madame. Tell me, what did he offer?" The Duchess lowered her eyes, feigning modesty. "Only flattery, my lord." Nothing of substance. Louvois' gaze narrowed. "Do not play me for a fool. You will tell me everything, or I will assume you have chosen another master." In that moment, the Duchess realized the peril of her position. To refuse him was death. To obey was chains. She left his chamber with her composure intact, but inside she felt the walls closing in. That night, she unlocked her casket once more. The vial glimmered in her hand, more familiar than a friend. She whispered to it, as though it could answer, "If I cannot choose whom I serve, then I will choose when the game ends." The following weeks passed in a blur of calculated survival. She gave Louvois fragments, hints of Austria's whispers, careful enough to satisfy him, vague enough to protect herself. At the same time, she allowed the Austrian envoy to believe she might lean toward his promises. She balanced both sides, a dancer upon a razor's edge. But she began to notice something unsettling. She no longer felt fear. Once, her heart had raced at every shadow. Her hands had trembled with every secret. Now she moved with calm precision, as though she belonged to the darkness. It no longer consumed her. She wielded it. One night, as she stood alone before her mirror, she realized the truth. Versailles had taken the frightened bride and replaced her with something else, something sharper, something dangerous. And though the chandeliers still glittered, though the music still played, she knew the real Versailles was not made of gold. It was made of velvet and shadows. Spring crept back into Versailles, softening the frozen fountains, filling the air with the perfume of orange blossoms. The palace glittered brighter than ever, yet beneath the music and perfume lay the same dark current the Duchess had come to know so well. By now, her transformation was complete. No longer the anxious young widow, she had become something the courtiers whispered about in tones of awe and dread. "She knows too much," some muttered. "She has the ear of Louvois," others warned. "She will outlive us all," a few said with grim admiration. It was in this season that the king himself summoned her. The message came with no warning, delivered by a liveried page who bowed so low his forehead nearly brushed the marble floor. The Duchess entered the king's private chamber with measured grace. Louis XIV sat in his gilded chair, dressed not for ceremony, but in simple elegance, his face shadowed with the weight of age and rule. Madame de Maintenon stood at his side, her presence as steady and watchful as ever. "Madame," the king said, his voice still carrying the authority of a sovereign who had bent Europe to his will, "you have proven resourceful." The Duchess curtsied deeply. "I live to serve your majesty." Louis studied her for a long moment, his gaze unblinking. "France thrives because loyalty binds it. But I have heard whispers, too many whispers, that you are courted by other thrones. Tell me, where does your loyalty lie?" The chamber fell into silence. The Duchess felt the weight of two gazes, Louis, the Sun King, demanding truth, and Maintenon, sharp and discerning, searching for weakness. Every instinct screamed at her to choose caution, to swear herself utterly to France. Yet she knew the wrong word could bind her too tightly, could make her no more than a servant to Louvois or a pawn of Maintenon. She needed to rise above them all. "My king," she said at last, her voice steady, "my loyalty lies with survival, and survival lies with France. For as long as France endures, so shall I, and as long as I endure, I shall serve France, A dangerous answer, yet it was the truth, draped in velvet. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then, to her astonishment, Louis smiled faintly. "You speak as one who understands the nature of power." "Few do." He turned to Maintenon. "She will be of use." The Duchess bowed again, concealing the tremor that rippled through her. She had not only survived the king's test, she had secured his acknowledgement. From that moment, her place at Versailles shifted. She was no longer prey, no longer merely a whisper in the salons. She became a shadow at the very heart of the court, seen by some as a protector of France's secrets, by others as a threat too dangerous to cross. Yet the cost weighed upon her. In quiet hours, when the candles burned low, she thought of her husband, of the man who had once walked these same corridors, undone by the same poison that now safeguarded her life. She wondered if he would recognize what she had become. Sometimes, staring at the vial still hidden in her casket, she whispered to the memory of the girl she once was, "You are gone. Only I remain." But, even as she mourned that lost self, she could not turn back, for in Versailles there was no path but forward. To hesitate was to fall, and so the Duchess, clothed in silks and shadows, stepped more firmly into her role, not as victim, not even as survivor, but as architect of her fate. The velvet shadows embraced her at last. Summer returned, heavy with heat and secrets. The fountains of Versailles splashed in glittering arcs, yet beneath their music, the court seethed with unseen rivalries. Foreign envoys pressed closer, eager for favor. Ministers jostled for influence as the king's patience shortened. In this restless season, the Duchess discovered that power, once tasted, was more intoxicating and more perilous than she had ever imagined. She had become an enigma. To some, she was a loyal servant of the crown. To others, a woman who played both sides of every intrigue. Whispers called her La Dame de l'Ombre, the Lady of Shadows. She learned to wear the title like a jewel, neither denying nor confirming it, letting its mystery protect her more than any guard could. But mystery also drew enemies. One evening, after a long day of audiences and salons, she found a slip of parchment pressed beneath her door. The handwriting was elegant, almost mocking. "Your shadow stretches too far. Beware the light that burns it away." She read it thrice, her heart thrumming. It was not a threat of poison or steel, but of exposure. Someone knew too much, or feared she knew too much. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she sat by candlelight, turning the vial between her fingers, the liquid inside shimmering like captured moonlight. She wondered if the writer of the note had meant to frighten her into retreat, or to push her toward a fatal mistake. Days later, at a masquerade ball, she felt the danger more keenly. Masks glittered beneath chandeliers, laughter rang out, but the Duchess sensed eyes following her from across the hall. She drifted among dancers and courtiers, every smile hiding suspicion. At last, she slipped into the gardens, seeking air. There, in the shadows of the clipped hedges, she encountered Madame de Clermont once again. The woman's mask dangled from her hand, her expression unreadable. "So," Clermont murmured, "you have tasted power. Tell me, does it sweeten the blood or sour it?" The Duchess's voice was cool. "It keeps me alive." Clermont's gaze sharpened. "Alive, yes. But for how long? You play a dangerous game. Too dangerous, perhaps, for one woman to sustain." The Duchess stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "Then why did you give me the vial?" "You set me upon this path," Clermont smiled faintly, "because I saw in you what others did not. You were willing to see the truth, Versailles is built upon velvet and shadows. Those who refuse to see it are destroyed, but those who embrace it reshape it. The Duchess felt a chill, though the summer air was warm. And if I refuse, Clermont's eyes gleamed. Then you die. Like all the others who thought innocence could protect them, a silence stretched between them. The Duchess realized with sudden clarity that Clermont was not merely an ally or a threat. She was both. Perhaps even a mirror of what the Duchess herself was becoming. Later, returning to the hall, the Duchess joined the dance once more, her mask hiding the turmoil within. She moved with perfect grace, her smile serene, yet inside her heart whispered a truth she could no longer ignore. She was trapped in a game that could only end in triumph or ruin. The velvet shadows had made her powerful, but they had also marked her. And in Versailles, marked women seldom survived for long. Autumn cloaked Versailles in amber light, the gardens aflame with dying leaves, the air heavy with the musk of fading blooms. Yet inside the palace, the brilliance of chandeliers defied the season, and the intrigues burned hotter than ever. It was in this season of endings that the Duchess realized her power had reached its most precarious height. One afternoon, while attending a private recital in the apartments of Madame de Maintenon, the Duchess felt the weight of every gaze. Courtiers leaned in, their conversations lowering when she passed. Some greeted her with smiles too sharp, others with silences too deliberate. She had become not merely a player in Versailles, but one of its symbols. Proof of how far one could rise and how swiftly one could fall. That evening she received an anonymous package. Inside lay a goblet, ornate and gleaming, its rim dusted with a faint, bitter powder. Beneath it, a note. For the Lady of Shadows, drink deeply as you have taught others to do. Her breath caught. Someone wanted her gone. Yet rather than fear, a strange calm filled her. The message was not a threat alone. It was acknowledgement. She had become dangerous enough to kill. Instead of burning the goblet or discarding it, she locked it in her casket beside the vial. Two relics side by side, the instrument of her rise and the warning of her fall. Weeks later, at a grand feast, the danger sharpened. Goblets clinked, dishes arrived in glittering procession, laughter rang under painted ceilings. Yet when her wine was poured, she noticed the faintest ripple, as though something unseen disturbed its surface. Her hand froze. The room seemed to tilt. Across the table she caught Louvois watching her, his expression unreadable. A test or a trap? The Duchess lifted the glass, her face serene. She touched it to her lips, but did not drink. Instead, with practiced grace, she set it aside and reached for another. In that instant, she felt the balance shift. Whoever had meant to poison her now knew she had seen, and by surviving, she had announced herself as more than lucky. She was untouchable. That night, she returned to her chambers trembling, yet alive. The vial waited, gleaming softly in the casket. She realized that she had not needed it this time. Her survival had come not from poison, but from the knowledge of its presence. Power lay not in using the vial, but in being the kind of woman who could. Still, the cost pressed upon her. Alone in the dark, she thought of the girl she once was, the one who had burned her husband's letters in terror, who had trembled at shadows in corridors. That girl was gone, consumed by the velvet night of Versailles. And yet, another truth dawned with terrible clarity. She no longer wished for escape. The palace that had once threatened to devour her had become her hunting ground. She was no longer prey. She was a predator. As the season waned, the Duchess stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the air sharp with the scent of frost. Below, nobles strolled in silks, laughing, whispering, plotting. She gazed at them with eyes colder than the marble beneath her feet. The velvet shadows had claimed her completely. She was no longer their victim. She was their queen. Winter closed in once more, and Versailles glittered like ice beneath the pale sun. The Duchess now walked its corridors with a silence that commanded more fear than words ever could. She was not old, yet the years of secrets had carved a depth into her eyes, a sharpness into her smile. Those who once dismissed her as a widow of little consequence now measured their words carefully in her presence. Still, survival in Versailles was never permanent. One evening, she was summoned quietly, not by Louvois, not by Maintenon, but by the king himself. A page led her through winding halls into a chamber smaller than she expected, where Louis XIV sat alone. Age had etched itself upon him. Though his wig and robes still shone with magnificence, his face was marked by fatigue, his once bright eyes dulled by time. "Sit," he said simply. The Duchess obeyed, lowering herself into a chair opposite him. "You have been spoken of often in my council," the king began, his voice low, deliberate. "Some call you loyal, others dangerous. Tell me, why should I permit your shadow to stretch across my court?" The question was no less perilous than poison. The Duchess felt her heart still, then quicken. Yet she answered with calm conviction, "Because, sire, shadows protect as much as they conceal. I gather whispers so that others cannot use them against your majesty. I survive so that France survives. My shadow is yours." For a long moment, the king studied her. Then, to her astonishment, he laughed, a dry, weary sound. "You speak with the confidence of one who has learned what it costs to live here. Perhaps you will endure longer than most." He dismissed her with a flick of his hand. She rose, curtsied, and left, her pulse racing. She had not only survived the king's test, she had won a sliver of his respect. But the interview also revealed something chilling. Louis XIV, once untouchable, was fading. His death would come, perhaps not soon, but soon enough for the courtiers, already sharpening their claws. And when he fell, Versailles would splinter. The Duchess returned to her chambers, the weight of inevitability pressing upon her. She opened her casket and stared at the vial, unchanged, still gleaming like frozen light. She realized she might never need to use it again. Its power lay not in the poison itself, but in what it had made of her. In the weeks that followed, she moved with greater assurance than ever. Whispers no longer frightened her. They fed her. Offers from foreign envoys amused her more than they tempted her. Even Louvois, once her captor in the shadows, now treated her as an equal, a creature forged by the same ruthless fire. One night, at a ball where music thundered and chandeliers blazed, she caught her reflection in a mirror. For a moment, she saw not herself, but the countless others who had perished here, victims of ambition, of poison, of betrayal. And then she saw her own gaze, steady and unflinching. She was not among the dead. She had become something else. The Duchess smiled faintly at her reflection. She had walked through fire and shadows, and she had emerged alive. Changed, yes, but alive. And as the violins swelled and the dancers whirled around her, she whispered the words only she would hear. "The velvet shadows are mine,